Hello, I'm Jerry Bowyer. Welcome to Meeting of Minds podcast. I'm talking today with one of my favorite public intellectuals. I think really understates the matter. Scholars, economic scholars, literature scholars, historians. Deirdre McCloskey. Professor McCloskey, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, I'm extremely glad to be here.
Professor of economics, professor of communication, professor of English, emeriti, and the author of a marvelous set of books, best known probably for the Bourgeois trilogy. I'm holding with me right now I could say a summary and maybe a more accessible version of that, called Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich.
With Art Carden.
With Art Carden, another economics professor, as I recall.
Yes, he is, and another economic historian like I am.
How the bourgeois deal enriched the world. All right, well, let's start with this. This is probably the work you're best known for, the whole bourgeois, the prudence and the equality and the dignity, and prudence itself is an important virtue. Yeah. I'm not clear what got you started in that direction. What was the trigger?
Well, I've in all my academic career, which was about British economic history, I found myself defending the business people in Britain from the claim that they had failed in the late 19th century because Germany and the United States developed, which, when you put it that way, you can see how strange the claim that they failed is. So I started out a long time ago when I was a teenager as a Marxist. So I've gone from Marxism to libertarianism and beyond, and this was part of my progression. But in the 1990s, I started to think, well, I should write a book defending the ethics of what we usually call capitalism. I don't like the word capitalism. I'd rather call it innovism, which is a scientifically more accurate word. But in any case, and then that first volume, which was published in 1906, was called The Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And then I realized, as an economist, that my talk about the ethical change that had happened in Holland and then in England in the 17th and 18th century, in which people stopped hating the bourgeoisie as much as they did before, the middle class, had resulted in the modern world. I mean, you can call it the Enlightenment if you want, but I don't think it's really the Enlightenment that's the issue here. It's what Adam Smith, the blessed Adam Smith, would have said, it did say, was liberalism. The idea that hierarchies, the old hierarchies, should be dissolved, that women shouldn't be slaves to men, and slaves shouldn't be slaves to masters, and no one should be slaves to the state. And then it took me a while. I didn't know before I started to write this that I was going to end up with 1,700 pages of evidence and argument from literature and philosophy and economics and blah, 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 baseball. I mean, it was just crazy. And the conclusion was that it's what made the modern world, what made us rich and made us not too bad, ethically speaking, was freedom, liberalism.
Liberalism as a political order, but you also talk a lot about a cultural shift.
Yes, indeed.
Right, the bourgeois virtues.
Well, indeed, and indeed that's a crucial part of it, because it's not Max Weber over again. Max Weber, a great German sociologist and economist, 100 years ago, over 100, made the argument that the Protestant ethic came to be the source of modern economic growth, and I think that's wrong. Although his book 1905, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, is one of the great books of the modern world, and everyone should read it. But it wasn't a psychological change inside the businessmen's head, mainly men, It was the attitude of the rest of the society towards them that changed. And that's crucial.
Cultural permission, if you will.
Exactly. Cultural permission, which in all of our gradual liberations is what matters. I mean, votes for women came as men, who were actually the ones who were going to vote for it one way or the other, came to give cultural permission to women to enter the political sphere. And the same happened earlier with slavery. The abolition movement was a turn in the attitude towards slavery, not attitude of the slaveholders, that's for sure, or even the slaves.
So you have to have a Harriet Beecher Stowe before you can have an Abraham Lincoln. You have to have the cultural shift.
That's exactly right. As he said to her, when Lincoln said to her as he met her, I've met the little woman who started this big war. That's what he said.
Yes.
And it's true that I've more and more come to understand that it's ideas that run the world, more or less entirely. We in economics tend to think, no, it's interest.
Yes, maximum utility.
I call him Max U in German. Maximize utility subject to constraints. And that's okay, I mean, that's fine, but it's a part of life.
Right.
You know, when you're buying stuff at the grocery store, you don't look for the most expensive item, you look for the best relative to the cost.
Right.
So we're all maximizers to some degree. But if we're only maximizers, we lack hope and faith and love and temperance and courage and justice. Greed is prudence only. Prudence is a great and glorious virtue.
But charity, the greatest of these, is love.
Faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. 1 Corinthians 13. So this idea of the virtues shifting a bit. It's not that they're entirely new virtues.
Right.
Of the middle class. The sort of, so to speak, the subject of the virtues changes a bit. Instead of courage being always about battlefields, it's also about enterprise.
Yes.
And instead of love being all about monasteries and sacrificing yourself on the cross, it's about the love that's necessary for any kind of successful enterprise. If an office, and anyone who's hearing this knows this, if an office or a group of other workers hate each other,
doesn't work.
If they have not love, they are as sounding brass and clanging cymbals. Clanging cymbals.
Yes.
And it's so true.
Yes.
It's a profound truth. So the sort of an argument that came to be in the 18th century rather suddenly was the argument that the virtues matter for economic life. And economic life is not any different from, well, it's different from spiritual life. It's the profane and the sacred. But in all human lives they interact. The sacred, whether it's God or the Chicago Cubs or art, is an answer to the question, so what? Whereas the exercise of the profane virtues, such as prudence mainly, is about means, about instrumentality.
Sometimes they're called the pagan virtues because even the pagans know them. And then there's the Christian virtues on top, right?
That's right. In fact, in that first book that you mentioned in 2006, The Bourgeois Virtues, that's the framework I use. I didn't use utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham or Kant, the categorical imperative. Any of these little formulas that philosophers in the 18th century loved to make up. No, I use the ancient and universal idea that the smart way to talk about good and bad people is to start talking about their particular virtues.
So it's an interesting word. It's a counterculture word. I remember Bill Bennett told me once that the publisher wanted to name the book of Values.
Yeah.
And he said, no, it's the Book of Virtues. And you've also chosen virtues.
I have.
So I think I understand the reason why, but I'm asking, why virtues rather than values?
Well, as he said, and I kind of admire his book. I don't think, he was a professional philosopher, and he should have done more research, especially in theology, before he got going on this book. But in any case, my great guide here is St. Thomas Aquinas, who goes through, as you point out, the four pagan virtues of courage, temperance, justice, and prudence, to which is added by Christians faith, hope, and love. And it's a sort of a jury-rigged 4 plus 3, oh well, it kind of goes together. The idea in the pagan world that love would be a principal virtue is loony.
Right.
That's what's so striking about Christianity. God is love is utterly meaningless in the pagan world. But it turns out that just values, I value Fritos or something, is not enough. You've got to be specific. And that's why Bennett insisted on the word virtues, and I do too.
And values has a certain whiff of relativism. You value one thing, I value another.
Yeah,
but virtue is good, and vice is bad.
Yeah, that's right.
Whereas values sets us up for an equivalence.
Yeah, that's right. Although I'm more amiable about my friends in postmodernism. In some ways, I call myself a postmodernist because I do believe that values change. I mean, that's my whole point. That what the definition, or as I said before, the object of the virtue, what you were doing when you had courage, moved from battlefield courage to commercial courage.
Yes.
So there was a change.
Yes.
So
a values change.
The values changed, but the virtues, I would claim, are pretty much universal.
So would I.
In the coyote tales of the Plains Indians, virtues are on display. They're not exactly Christian virtues, but they're virtues. In Confucian thought, you find close parallels to what the people were talking about in the West in the Middle Ages. In South Asia, the same thing. So wherever you go, people, of course, they value courage, because the courage of the mother of a severely handicapped child to get out of bed every day and take care of her boy, that's courage. It's also a love surpassing understanding. And that's what we need to be talking about. We have libraries in all the languages of the world about these particular virtues.
Yes.
The stories we tell. My friend Wayne Booth, a great English professor at the University of Chicago, once started a chapter by saying, well, when you ask what the meaning of life is, one way to answer it is to, give an analysis of life. But another way is to say, a child was born in Bethlehem.
And that gave meaning
that
to
gives
all
meaning
life.
To all life.
Yes.
And to your own life. And so there's it's through stories.
Who said that? I have never.
Wayne Booth is his name. He was a marvelous, humane man. He was raised as a Mormon, but fell away from the church. But it was a great professor of English. He was the president of the big professional association for students of literature. The Modern Language Association.
Modern Language Association.
Yeah.
it just sort of comes into my mind. A child was born in Bethlehem, and not Rome.
Yeah, that's right.
Not even Jerusalem. The Magi went looking in Jerusalem.
That was the whole point.
Yes.
That a God who died, a God who was a carpenter, a God who was truly human, as the Credo says. This is very weird.
Yes.
In the pagan story.
Right. Just a little aside. Bethlehem.
Yeah.
You know a little bit.
I've never been there. I'm going to go the next time I go to Israel.
I would love to go there. I haven't been there either. Bethlehem, House of Bread. Interesting Eucharistic overtones there.
House of David.
House of David. That's right. It was known as the House of David. But I was looking at. There's some interesting material in the rabbinical writings, the Midrash. You're an economic historian, right?
Yeah.
And you know that there are economic bases. Like when you go to a particular region. I'm from Pittsburgh. The economic basis was manufacturing.
Sure.
Right. Okay. The economic base of Bethlehem, it was set aside for shepherds, which is no surprise if you read the nativity accounts. But shepherds were borderline unclean in rabbinical tradition, right? Because they might eat somebody else's grass.
Right.
But they set aside a place for the breeding of sheep for sacrifice in the temple.
Oh yeah.
And that place is Bethlehem.
Oh really?
Migdal Adair is the actual. There's a tower, so they'd be bred there, and then they'd be expected as they go through the tower. So the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world, was born in a city whose
wonderful.
Industrial export.
I didn't know that.
Was the sacrificial lambs for the temple.
That's terribly interesting.
Isn't that fascinating?
That is wonderful.
There's so much stuff this is in the Midrash, and I found it through Joseph Edersheim, a Victorian, almost unreadable Victorian Jewish convert to the Church of England, fellow Anglican.
I love Jewish scholarship, and I've studied it. There's a Jewish debate tradition, which is so wonderful. The school of Shammai.
Yes,
the school of Hillel.
Yes.
Hillel says this. I just love it. I mean, I'm an academic, of course I do.
And I don't know if you'll agree with this, because you have de-emphasized to some degree the influence of Christian ideas on the rise of human betterment, and
I have.
But in some ways emphasize the structural changes of decentralization that come about through the nonconformist traditions.
Yeah.
But there's a reasonable argument that the rediscovery of the Hebraic tradition by the theologians in Holland after rabbis had fled persecution, that you get all these books. Eric Nelson from Harvard writes about this. Almost all these books have the same title, The Hebrew Republic. And they're arguing from the Jewish scriptures for a decentralized order and private property.
Well, that indeed was the founding constitution, so to speak, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Right.
Which we shall build in Jerusalem, in New England's green and pleasant land, and that was their idea, and they talked about it all the time, as you say. But I'm not too enthusiastic about this attempt to Europeanize innovism. I mean, it happened in Europe. It happened in Holland first, and then in England, but it's not Max Weber. It's not the Protestant ethic, because it happens under Catholicism too in some parts. But it's not. Liberalism is the key here. This idea, as Adam Smith said, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Adam Smith, for his time, was very egalitarian. He didn't go so far as to say that women were equal to men, but all men were equal, as the slave owner of Virginia said. And it's that's the novelty, and it's really new. It was expressed very well in the late 18th century. Late 19th century, by an American man in these parts, here in the West, who was asked by
We're in South Dakota, by the way, at a
South
conference.
Dakota,
Yes.
was asked by a naive, probably Englishman, who is your master? This was 1880 or something. And he said, he ain't been born yet. And that's about right. And that's very new.
Yes.
It was a terror in the political discussions before the English Civil War. The idea of masterless men. Ooh, scary music.
Right.
You know, ooh, 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 ooh.
Right.
And there was supposed to be a hierarchy, the great chain of being from the queen to the family dog. By the way, God is spelled dog backwards.
Yeah.
Got to remember that. That's quite important.
Yes.
And so we would like, we white people would like it to be Europeans who did all this. And we've got the good case to be made that they did it in the 18th century, but they didn't do it because they were Europeans.
I don't think I've understood until just now your kind of part of the motivation behind your view on this. It's avoiding a Eurocentrism.
That's right, and it's not just that I'm a lefty or something. I assure you, I'm not. Although I have been in my life. It's because it's so clear that other people besides Westerners can adopt a position of liberalism in the old sense, not in the modern American sense,
right,
and succeed.
Right.
The old believers in Russia, who are this extremely conservative sect in Orthodoxy.
Yes.
Were the great entrepreneurs of 18th and 19th century Russia. And when they go somewhere else, there are a bunch of them in Australia for some reason. And they own a bunch. They're a big deal. They're sort of like Jews.
Yes.
Or Chinese.
Yes, overseas Chinese.
Overseas Chinese.
Or Huguenot were the same thing for a while.
Exactly.
There's something
Huguenot.
about sort of strong religion.
Absolutely.
And
although it doesn't have to be the Chinese case shows that it doesn't have to be religious.
Right.
But anyhow, strong identity.
Yes.
Makes for it.
Peter Berger, you know who I'm talking about?
I do know
Peter.
I'm sorry to say I didn't ever meet him. He died, I believe.
He did, yes.
I'm sorry that happened.
I had the honor to have conversations like this with him, and he said, the perfect formula for wealth creation is a Confucian culture in a non-Confucian nation. And that's why the overseas, right, because the Confucianism has a very negative view towards commerce,
it does.
But it has a high view of productivity and hard work and respect.
Exactly.
And so you just get Confucian people out of Confucian stultifying.
That shows how important this ideology is.
Right.
How this ethical change, where we start changing, we, say Europeans or Chinese or whoever, start changing our attitude towards the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the merchants and manufacturers. Look, that's what happened in China after 1978. The Communist Party said, oh, well, whatever. We made a mistake about this central planning. Go do what you want. And Chinese national income increased from about $2 a day to $45 a day.
What a miracle.
It was a wonderful miracle. If you going to China is stunning. That $45 a day is 1/3 of American national income per head, so don't get too excited about it. But on the other hand, it's a great improvement over $2 a day.
Yes.
And it happened not because of some Chinese model, tyranny's good for you.
Right.
It was the absence of tyranny in the economy, if not in the politics.
I think Ron Kosa argued that it happened almost by accident. There were some neglected places at the edge where the markets were allowed to function a little, and all of a sudden they were so dynamic that in some sense they'd almost lost control.
Yes, I was friendly with Ronald Coase when he was my colleague at Chicago, not deeply friendly, but friendly and admired his work. And then he and my other friend, the Chinese guy, did a book about the economic growth in China. What is the other guy's name? And I
can't remember it either.
I know him better.
So the software that you're talking about,
Bourgeois software. That's a very good way to express it.
It runs on every variety of human hardware.
Yep, that's exactly right. And there's no, as far as we can tell, there's no genetics here. I mean, look, it's fairly clear that Ashkenazi Jews have an unusual ability for mathematics and the violin. Okay, fair enough. That may be, but if they were crushed in the expression of this, it wouldn't come out.
Right.
And indeed, under the old regime, I mean the really old regime, before the Haskalah, before the Enlightenment of Jews, it was crushed. So although they were fiddlers, they were folk fiddlers, not classical musicians, and they weren't mathematicians at all. So I'm not saying that people are all the same.
A genetic capacity is not enough.
It's not enough.
Right.
What you need is this social approval, as I think you put it earlier.
Permission.
Yes.
Picking up a word you're using.
My word for liberalism is not equality of opportunity, which is a mistaken idea. It's a big mistake.
Right.
It's equality of permission.
Right.
Let women work. My mom couldn't get a bank account in her own name until around 1960. Of course, you need permission. You need permission to braid hair for a living without having to get a license from the state. You need permission to start a business whenever you want.
And permission isn't just legal permission. This is the idea of culture. In other words, there are a few people who, let's say you legalize something, but everybody hates you for doing it.
Yeah.
There are a few people who will do that thing, but very few people.
Yeah, I completely agree. Right. It's true in intellectual life.
Right.
We talk about the left being intolerant of certain kinds of speech now. Well, I'm old enough to remember when the right was intolerant of certain kinds of speech in the McCarthy period.
Yes.
And it was more or less identical to what's happening now in academic life, except from the other politics. And so letting people talk, I don't care what, well, let's not go into that, but I want people to be able to converse.
You can go into anything you want to as far as I'm concerned.
Well, this afternoon I was very ashamed. I walked away from a conversation. I got so annoyed by the woman. And if I see her again, I'm going to apologize. Because walking away is not how we advance. If we want to advance as a civilization, we've got to listen to each other. As I said the other day, God gave us one mouth and two ears for a reason.
Speaking of God, I'm reminded of a conversation that Jesus had with a rich young ruler, right, often neglected in economic explications of the taxes that he was a ruler. But that's not what I'm talking about at this moment. They have a conversation, but who walks away?
The young man.
Jesus was not the walk away guy.
He didn't walk away. He never walked away.
And we shouldn't be the walk away people.
No, he's not. He said the young man walked away sadly, I think it says in some translations, because Jesus had said, if you want to follow me, give all your wealth to the poor.
Yes.
And follow me.
And he walked away sad because he had much katime, much landed property.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of thinking about your worldview, right? There's the old conservative, the Downton Abbey.
That's right.
Right.
The landed class.
Blood and soil. And the young man is a blood and soil.
Indeed.
Right? He's a member of the Sanhedrin. He's wealthy, but he's young. Yeah. There were no tech entrepreneurs, so if you're wealthy and young, you inherited it, and you inherit the seat on the Sanhedrin.
Yeah, that's true.
So Jesus was having this conflict, this, dare I even say, bourgeois conflict. With kind of an up-and-coming revolutionary class on one side and a conservative, a Carlyle, blood and soil type on the other side.
Conservatives.
Right.
Thomas Carlyle, early 19th century English essayist and writer, was in favor of slavery.
Yes.
This was in the middle of abolitionism, and his friends, his liberal economist friends, like John Stuart Mill, who was a friend of his, that were in favor of abolishing slavery.
Yes.
Slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, and Carlyle took a dim view of that. He said, it's like the serfs in the Middle Ages. That was lovely. and they danced around the maypole, and slavery in the Caribbean is not so bad. Why are we so nasty about this? And then that's when he called economics, or
dismal science,
political economy, the dismal science.
Yes, as opposed to the gay science, which is
the
poetry.
Gay science was poetry,
right,
and dancing in the maypole,
right,
and all this lovely nationalism, as you say, blood and soil, enthusiasm for who we are when we're born. And the whole liberal idea is that who you are when you're born is not the last deal. If you have permission,
right,
we're not all going to be Andrew Carnegie's or whoever, or Mae West is my hero, but she said, I'm in favor of the institution of marriage, but I'm not ready for an institution.
So I think Carlyle argued that you can't have poets if you don't have slaves.
That's right, exactly. And you can kind of see the economics of what he's saying. He's saying that in order to have leisure, you've got to have slaves. But this even then, that was extremely dubious. Robert Burns, superbly talented and most ways successful poet, was a common Scottish farmer.
I think, yeah.
And he died not because he was poor, but because of the disease environment, alas.
So that's fast. And I seem to remember Carlyle mentioning Exeter Hall when he with the dismal science, which so free trade, nonconformist religion, and slave abolition, and it's sort of in our modern political world. I don't see that party. I don't see the party that's all the humans are humans and we're going to treat everybody with dignity.
I wish that's what we need. We need to take the fractured Republican Party and make it into what H.L. Mencken, the great journalist of a century ago, said the United States needed, a party of liberty. Then it would be quite clear. The Democrats, I was once a Democrat myself, and I was a socialist and everything, and I have many Democratic friends. They can be the party of socialism, of democratic socialism, as they call it, and then we liberals could be the party of liberty. And then there would Then there would be a real discussion. Is it better to treat people, you and me, as sad or bad children?
That's the conservative version.
That's the bad one is the conservative version.
See. And sad is
the sad version is the left's version.
Right.
So either you're bad or you're sad. That's statism. That's the usual left to right political spectrum. Or do you treat people as adults? Now that doesn't mean no charity and screw you, I'm rich and you're poor, I don't care. That's not what it means. I'm a Christian liberal. I acknowledge a responsibility towards the poor, but my main responsibility is to make sure that the government or whoever doesn't put hooks and shares in their way. Right.
Well, Jude Wanniski, the journalist, said the Republicans are the daddy party and the Democrats are the mommy party.
That's exactly right.
And the answer is, wait a minute, we're already adults.
That's the point. I'm glad you reminded me of that. There have been lots of analyses of this about the psychology of Democrats versus Republicans. And it always comes to the same idea, daddy and mommy. And, I'm an adult, you're an adult, let's get treated like adults. And so I want to call what I value liberalism in this 19th century sense, I want to call it adultism. That we're not going to treat people as sad or bad children. We're going to treat them as adults. That means treating women as adults, which was the big issue in the coming of votes for women. Oh, no, the poor dears need to be taken care of by the men. Oh, the men.
Well, he'll vote on her behalf.
That's right.
He'll vote in her interest,
The men can represent her.
Yes.
Don't worry, dear. Your role is in the home. blah, blah, blah. And we got over that, and we started treating women as adults.
Right.
And we started treating blacks as adults.
Right.
Instead of darkies playing the banjo around the old cabin door. And that's it, adultism. Treating gays
Yes.
as respected adults.
Right.
That happened very quickly in the United States.
Yes.
I mean, that changed very fast. The idea of gay marriage was unheard of in that.
And then, right.
And it shows how fast these, what would you call them, these surrounding attitudes can change. See, look, I claim that what's wrong with Max Weber is, oddly for a sociologist, he has a psychological theory of the middle class, of the business world, that the psychology changed, of the businessman. I don't think so. I think you can go to Rome and ancient China and South Asia and find look, think of the great religion of Islam that came from a merchant of Mecca.
Right.
Come on.
Right.
So it's not the psychology. It's the sociology.
Because sociology gives permission to psychology.
Exactly.
It allows you to be who you are, or it doesn't.
Look,
right.
if there's no such thing as baseball, the unusual people who can hit a major league fastball, we wouldn't know about them.
Right.
Babe Ruth
Right.
would have been a filling station attendant.
Right.
But now we know. And that's, of course, the great enrichment. I actually call it the great enrichment of the modern world, that results in this tremendous variety of ways in which we can show our gifts. Think again of Corinthians 12, in which St. Paul talks about the gifts. Some have the gifts of prophecy, some have the gifts of tongue,
right.
Some have the gifts
interpretation,
of this,
right.
that, of interpretation.
Right.
And it's an economic argument.
It is, isn't it?
It's an argument for the diversity of roles in which we can choose. It's not that we're born with it necessarily, but, well, actually, Babe Ruth is born with this great skill. But it wouldn't have come up if there was no such thing as baseball.
Yeah, it's division of labor.
It's division of labor.
And I'm sort of reminded we're quite near to Deadwood, and there's a historical figure there, the preacher in Deadwood, and there's a TV series about it. I don't know if you've seen it. And
I've not been able to watch it because it's so profane.
It is.
They use the F word
so
every
much.
Other sentence.
Yes,
that I really got a little tired.
It is, and I don't know what to do. And I mean, you can skip the pornographic stuff, but you can't skip the bad language.
I'm told by my friends who do this that it's very good drama, and I'm prepared to admit that, but.
And there's a preacher character, and he's historically based, and he keeps preaching on Corinthians. The body needs the hand. If the hand says, I have no need of the foot.
That's a very old metaphor. You find it in Shakespeare, of course that's rather late, in his play Coriolanus, where the aristocrat is trying to calm down this mob of plebes. And
yes.
He says,
yes.
You people are the great toe.
I'm the mouth.
I'm the mouth and the brain. You're the great toe. And they were really annoyed by this guy calling them great toes.
He makes an actual argument for trickle-down economics, not genuine growth, but we'll eat, and then the food, the mouth eats the food, and then it eventually gets to the toe.
Neither trickle down or trickle up makes any sense as economics.
Right.
And there's a lot of kind of folk Keynesianism in the minds of most politicians and journalists that is either trickle down or trickle up, and that's not really how an economy works.
It's interesting. Coriolanus really kind of fits with your idea of adultism because it's a major theme of the poem. He makes bad decisions, and his mother says, you're a boy. Keeps saying you're insulting him as a boy because he's making these...
I haven't thought about that, but being a Roman man, and Shakespeare, if it was Shakespeare, maybe the Earl of Oxford, understood very well that being a man in the Roman Republic meant taking on these roles.
And he fails to. He doesn't grow up.
I know, he won't do it.
I wonder, given what you're saying about adulthood and adultism, right?
Yeah.
If we aren't adults...
Not adultery.
No, that's
but adultery,
different.
not the seventh commandment.
That's almost the opposite.
It is.
Of
It is.
because there's restraint issues, self-restraint.
Yeah.
Will, to the degree that the government infantilizes us, but to the degree that the culture infantilizes us, does that beckon forth an adult supervisory government? Whether it's a bad idea, but
but that's absolutely crucial. It's the artists, particularly the popular artists, who run our politics without us even knowing it. It's not their fault. They don't intend to. There's not some big conspiracy. But if country music, for example, is all about how mean the boss is and I wish the government would help me, that's one thing. But if country music, as some of it is I don't care a damn, I'm going to move to another job, then it comes out a completely different way. When I was a kid, I was a folkie and sang, I know more socialist songs than my socialist friends. And, I knew Woody Guthrie's songs and Joe Hill and all that. But that's a musical genre of whining.
Yes.
Of complaint.
Right.
And what we need is art.
Right.
That not emphasize.
My wife left, so I lost my job, my dog died. Right.
That's right.
Someone said you played the music backwards.
You all get them back.
You get your dog resurrects and your wife comes back to you.
Absolutely. This is play a country music back. You have country music, you'll see it works. But there are artistic expressions of this adultism. For example, there's a movie of about 8 years ago called Joy.
Ah, yes.
About Joy Mangano.
Yes.
And the inventor of the self-squeezing mop, who's very successful in business. And then about the same time, The Founder.
Yes.
With Michael
Keaton.
Keaton.
Michael Keaton.
Michael
Yes.
Keaton.
Yes.
About McDonald's. And those were both expressions of what really makes innovism work. Is people with courage, justice, temperance, love, hope, faith. I'm actually going to do a paper for an academic conference of theologians that's meeting in Belgium, in Leuven, in November, for the Oxford Book of Hope.
Interesting.
And it's mainly theologians, I said, but my assignment is to connect the theological virtue of hope with the business world. And it's rather obvious that it does connect.
Oh, entrepreneurship is hope.
The things unseen. That's what it's all
Same
about.
thing our friend Vernon Smith wrote about.
Exactly.
Hebrews 11:1.
I heard Vernon the other day. I heard an interview of Vernon. That's what he said. He said exactly Hebrews. Yeah.
Substance of things not seen. That's
Substance
entrepreneurship is substance of things not seen. Right.
Of course it is.
Right. So, speaking of Vernon Smith, your newer book is Bettering Humanomics.
Yes, it is.
So it has two of your things, right? The betterment thing, right? And
That's
also
right.
the Humanomics, which is
That's
something that you write about and he's written about.
Yeah, he has.
Can you tell us a little bit? I mean, there's a lot of overlap between that and your history books, but
this
is more rethinking economic theory rather than telling a historical story.
It is.
Yeah.
It's about the state of economics. I've written before on the state of economics. I had kind of a trilogy. I didn't intend it to be, but it ended up being one. Back in the 80s and early 90s, where I said economists used metaphors in one book, economists used stories in a second book, and then in a third book I undertook to talk about the philosophy of all the people who were outraged by me saying that economists were like poets and novelists. They just couldn't stand it. So that was a trilogy. But this is a new, what's it's called? Not a duopoly, a duology of two books. One is called Bettering Economics from the University of Chicago
Maybe a
Press.
duology. How does that sound?
Duology,
Yes.
that's a good one.
Yeah.
And and then there's a second book coming out in the fall, which is a more critical you might say, angry book, attacking some of the worst tendencies in modern economics. But this first one is meant to be sweet talk and meant to kind of nicely present humanomics, as I call it, the subtitle says, a new and old way of doing economics.
You talk about sweet talk a lot in the book.
I do.
It's an important theme. Can you explain what that means?
All it means is persuasion.
Yeah.
Look, there are only two ways we can get people to do what we want. You can hold a gun to their head, or you can persuade them.
Yes.
There's no middle ground. There's no third thing. Lots of people think there is. That you prove something mathematically, that's different from persuasion. No, it's not. If you know anything about the history of mathematics, you know that that's completely false.
Right.
That mathematics is an exercise in persuasion.
Yes.
That doesn't make it relativistic or, hey man, how do you feel about the prime number theorem today? No.
Right.
It makes it a human science, science in the broad sense of systematic knowledge. And we do persuasion all the time in marriages, in conversations with friends or enemies, in politics, in the grocery. I mean, we all day long we're immersed in sweet talk, persuasion. The word sweet in English and in Germanic languages is cognate, is a cousin of the word in Latin suadio, which means I persuade. And persuadio means I thoroughly persuade. Through,
yeah.
I thoroughly persuade.
Right.
And but that's quite different from the other Latin word we often use for this, convince.
Vinco.
Convince is from vinco,
To conquer.
defeat.
Yes.
And I'm for suadio, not vinco.
Well, I was having a conversation with N.T. Wright. I don't know if you're familiar with a very influential New Testament scholar, and he's talking about apologetics.
Yeah.
And he's basically come to the conclusion that a lot of Christian apologetics is essentially something like imperialism, that we're just going to just like carpet bomb the atheists, with our 5 ways arguments and all the rest of it. When that's not why they're atheists in the first place, right? So you can't convince them, but maybe you can persuade them.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Although I know some of the new atheists. I was at a conference some years ago called Enlightenment 2.0, and their idea was that we're really enlightened, we atheists.
We're the brights.
We're the brights, exactly. That's what they say. And as though John Polkinghorne
isn't bright.
Was not bright. He was the professor of theoretical physics at Cambridge, or Francis Collins.
And a priest in our a fellow Anglican communion priest with us.
He was a priest in the Anglican Church. Became after he stopped being a physicist. And as though Newton, although he was a Unitarian, he was a believer. Come on, don't be silly.
Right. It's
not the brights. But I was at this conference, and it turned out that I was the only believer there, the only Christian. And about halfway through the conference, after I've heard these people going on about how the Enlightenment means getting away from this stupid idea of God and religion and all that crap, I stood up and said, consider the possibility, I didn't say it the way Cromwell did, consider in the bowels of Christ,
in the bowels of Christ, yes,
to the Scottish presbyters before invading Scotland, that you may be mistaken. And they were as though I had taken off my pants in public. They were just shocked. That and I was at a conference.
I think you're right about that in the Bettering Humanomics, right? That's in there, yes.
I do.
Yeah.
I think maybe I also have a story there of being at a small conference of biologists and a couple of economists in Vienna. And this was about evolution. And of course...
You're right about that.
Yeah. And then most sort of untutored intellectuals who believe they don't believe, they think that Christianity is Jerry Falwell in opposition to evolution. And my host, it came out that I was a Christian. And my host said she was just astounded. How can you be at a conference on evolution and be a Christian? Thank you, Jerry Falwell.
So you're working on your next book, which is God in Mammon.
Yes, it is.
Is it premature to talk about that,
no,
or
I love talking about it.
Or do we want to?
No,
Okay.
it's a book that I've been working on for a long time, for 20 years. It says the rather obvious thing that God and business, or Christianity and business, don't need to be enemies.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas an awful lot of public theology in the last century has assumed they are enemies.
Yes.
And I say, now come on, no. You can be a Christian and a businessman.
Mm-hmm.
In 14th century Florence, these were business people, but they were Christians. I'm telling you, they were.
Right.
And they didn't all end up in Dante's Inferno.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an attempt to get what's known in the trade as public theology,
Mm-hmm.
the social side of theology,
Mm-hmm.
To recognize economics and so on. I have acquaintances, I wouldn't call them friends, in the Catholic Church who are economists, and they do Catholic social teaching.
I see.
And I find their arguments very irritating and unpersuasive,
Mm-hmm.
because they don't really understand the economy. These are professional economists, professors of economics. Yet they believe that the core commitment of Christianity must be give away all your goods and follow me. And it doesn't have to be.
It's terrible exegesis.
It is, because parable after parable in the synoptic Gospels, let's leave out John, are about prudence.
Yes.
If the tree which will not yield figs, I think it was
figs.
Was figs.
Let it be cursed.
If it doesn't yield, cut it down.
Cut it down, right.
Feed it to the fire.
Yes.
And all the parables are pointing up to heaven and God. I understand that. I'm not making a kind of vulgar point that Jesus was a salesman or a car salesman or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I am making the point that Jesus lived in the world.
Right.
He was beyond the world.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole core of Christian thought is that he did live in the world.
Right.
By the way, there's a wonderful book by Norman Mailer, of all people, called The Gospel According to the Sun. It's a short little thing about the size as one of the Gospels, where this Jew, Norman Mailer, a secular Jew, it must be said, imagines what it was like to be Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And the key point he makes is that Jesus couldn't know that he was God. He could suspect it and believe it, and maybe. But if he knew it, he'd say, oh, well, who cares? I'll go up on the cross, put me up there, put some nails in my hands, I don't care, because I'm going to ascend to heaven. So there's this kind of doubt that Mailer brings in, which I think is intelligent.
Yes, it's an interesting point. May tease out some other things, that he was fully God and fully human. Homo factum est, right? He made man. He was made man.
Although, boy, that took centuries to get clear.
Right.
People kept arguing about it.
It seems like the liberals want to talk about the humanity, and the conservatives want to talk about the divinity and deny the humanity.
That's right.
So something like Mailer would be like traumatizing. I mean, the scriptures say that he grew in wisdom and knowledge and in favor with God and man.
That's right.
Right. So the human nature had development to do. Had betterment to do.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's the profound message that I'm trying to get. Well, whether my message is profound or not, I don't know. But what I'm trying to say in this book, this God and Mammon book, is that the flourishing of liberated people in the image of God
Yes.
is a result of both God and Mammon brought together.
Mm-hmm.
That you can't, there's a spiritual life to be had out in the Egyptian desert in a hut. I've read St. Anthony, and I know something about that a little bit. Okay, I get it. And there's a kind of extreme, I don't believe in God, I just make money version of Mammon.
Mm-hmm.
But I think most people want a life that's meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
But they want a life that uses God's gifts. It's quite. If you go up in a stele and sit there for 20 years.
Go up where?
A stele,
a
column.
I see.
Right,
Yes. Like a steelite, like
Right.
Simon Stylites.
Exactly,
Yeah, right.
exactly.
That's who you're referring to. Yeah.
That's right. If you go up in there and sit there, well, okay, I see it's a great spiritual sacrifice and blah, blah, blah. But wouldn't it be better if you came down and, made dinner?
Rather than having someone make dinner and send it up,
Exactly.
and then 12 hours later, dinner comes back down in a bucket that someone has to. I mean, you're not helping anybody.
Exactly. You're not
Exchange,
helping anybody.
right?
So the ascetic tradition, which is in extreme cases in South Asia and in Christianity as well, it's glorious in many ways, but there's a kind of spiritual pride in it that worries me. I did a paper on humility for the Anglican Theological Review, and talked about St. Catherine, who starved herself to death.
Walled in.
At the age, that you're thinking of Julian of Norwich.
Oh, sorry.
This is St. Catherine. She starved herself to death at the age that Jesus was supposed to have died by refusing to eat anything but the host, the consecrated host.
Yes, there's some spiritual pride.
There's some
Self-destructive spiritual
There's
pride.
spiritual pride there.
Right.
There's an old New Yorker cartoon, which is my theological guide here. It shows two monks walking in the cloister. And one monk says to the other, "But I am holier than thou." And at the last moment, Satan reaches in and takes his soul, obviously.
Well, you think about the Holy Trinity.
Yeah,
You've got a society there.
you do.
3 persons, and they exchange, right? The Father generates the Son in
Yeah.
classic theology. There's the spiration. They're giving each other gifts.
Yeah.
So I would ask this question. Are they giving each other gifts voluntarily, or are they giving each other gifts under compulsion?
Well, it can't be that any of the Trinity or God, taken as a whole, is under any compulsion.
Precisely.
I mean, that surely is the essence of God as understood in monotheism. I mean, in Zoroastrianism and in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, there's no other God.
Right.
Shema Israel,
Adonai
Eloheinu,
Eloheinu,
Adonai
Echad.
Eloheinu, Echad.
Yeah.
God is one.
Right.
God is, that's it.
Right.
Don't
Right.
argue with me.
No,
That's it.
no boss. So the 3
boss.
persons of the Trinity
Yeah.
lovingly exchange one
course.
another. And if you read the Gospels, they have sweet talk. This is
Yeah.
my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased.
That's right.
I listen to the Father. Everything that's given to me is given by the Father. It's better that I go away and the Spirit would come. It would be better for you. And the Spirit says, Abba in your heart. And he's the Spirit of the Son. They're constantly sweet talking about
Yeah, they
one
are.
another. And I don't know how you can look at that relationship and say, but here on earth, what God really wants is for us to be masters of each other.
But that's the problem. That's the big problem and the big conflict in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. And before the Civil War, the Southern theologians supporting slavery had the better argument. Because all over, I mean, what is it, 3 Timothy, or is there only one Timothy? I can't remember.
2.
It's not certain actually that it was written by St. Paul, but anyway, St. Paul recommends that a slave be sent back to his master
Philemon, you're thinking of Philemon.
Oh, it's not Timothy at all. It's
Yes.
Philemon.
So
You're right.
you have 1st and 2nd Timothy, and then you have Philemon.
Philemon.
Onesimus, he sends the slave.
That's right.
Which in Greek means helpful.
Yeah.
But, you read N.T. Wright on that. He starts out his 3,000 pages on Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And he puts that next to similar correspondence in the Roman world.
Mm-hmm.
And it is shockingly egalitarian in that context.
You mean
Paul's
is?
Yeah, Paul's saying he's a brother, I'm a brother.
Yeah, that's what he
Onesimus is your brother. Receive him as a brother.
that's right.
Now, and whatever he's done, put it on my account, even though you owe me everything. I mean, Paul is everything
I know,
but.
I know.
I mean, I think there's an argument here that he didn't want the early Christian church to end like Spartacus.
Yeah.
So
that's
there's a certain prudentialness.
Yeah, I suppose you're right. I was just writing about that passage a couple of days ago, and maybe I'll have to revise it a bit. But in any case, as I said, the slave owners had the better argument, but the abolitionists had the spirit. The slave owners may have had the law, but we had the spirit.
The grace.
We had the grace.
Right.
And I think there's no question about that. Although, it's not until the innovistic bourgeois middle class Protestants turn against the system of slavery
Right.
that it starts to disappear.
I look forward to the book,
Yeah.
God in Mammon. By the way, do you know which of your books, you'll have trouble guessing this, has influenced my day-to-day life the most?
No.
The Cult of Statistical Significance.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Because I'm a quant. I'm doing quantitative analysis,
yeah.
and you freed me from the slavery to the p-value.
I've had other scholars say that to me. Other quantitative intellectuals say that. Oh, you've liberated me. This is I see. I've come to McCloskey, not to Jesus, but to McCloskey. And the thing is, as you know from the book, it's not McCloskey. It's a theme that has been repeated over and over again in the last 100 years in statistical theory.
Right.
And people keep ignoring it.
The statisticians have understood. The economists.
Some statisticians, not
Fair
all
enough.
of them.
Right.
Bill Kruskal was my dean at the University of Chicago for a while, and he was in the statistics department. He was the president of the American Statistical Association. And Bill understood this. And his entry into the Encyclopedia of Statistics, which is a subcategory of the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, the 1967, is devastating on this point. So they knew it, but most of them didn't.
When Susan and I sit down with our boy Jeremy to do quantitative analysis, we're always looking for the oomph.
The oomph.
Don't give me a correlation. Don't give me an R square.
Tell me how big it is.
Right.
You'll make more money that way.
Right.
You'll get the science right that way.
Right.
You'll know what you're talking about that way. I'm so alarmed the way statistical significance has grown in medicine.
Yes.
Oh, God, it's awful.
Yeah, I actually read a lot of medical papers, and it's always p-values. It's statistical significance, and as when I talk to physicians who are kind of the cutting edge of research, who are smart, they'll talk more about clinical significance.
Of course.
Is this going to save lives?
Of course.
Not can this get the
else
p-value
is
gets you published. A low p-value gets you published, but clinical significance and oomph gets you saving lives or wealth.
Does.
Yes.
Of course it does.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you thought, this Bowyer guy, I hoped he would ask me this, or why didn't he ask me such and such?
No. I think this has been a very fruitful conversation. I've liked it very much.
I've enjoyed it immensely.
I like nothing more than serious intellectual conversation I don't mean people who know a lot. I can have then
you're very happy here.
I can have.
I'm right in your wheelhouse. If you're looking for people who don't know a lot.
Oh, come on. I can have. I think anyone who's serious about an intellectual life can have a serious intellectual conversation with, say, a 5-year-old, if you're thoughtful about it.
Right.
Yeah. But I'm not putting you in the 5-year-old class.
5-year-old.
We're adults here.
We're adults.
Adultism.
Adultism, exactly. That's the bait and permission and innovationism. Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich is the book that's been out for a few months, and that's probably the book that's going to be of interest to most of my listeners. But those who are actually in economics or interested in economics will also benefit, I think, a lot from bettering Humanomics. Professor Deirdre McCloskey, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.
It really has. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and give it a rating on Apple Podcasts, and improve our national conversation by sharing it with some friends.